Hello and welcome to this video on the events leading up to the American Civil War. The American Civil War was a defining moment in the country's history, and it's important to understand the events that led up to it. In this video, we'll be discussing the key factors that contributed to the Civil War, including Lincoln's presidency, secession, attempts at peace, and the split between the North and the South. Lincoln's election. Lincoln was elected as president in 1860, and his victory sparked outrage among many Southern states. Lincoln was a member of the Republican Party, which was opposed to the expansion of slavery. The Southern states saw Lincoln's election as a threat to their way of life, as they relied heavily on slavery for economic success. Lincoln's domestic policies. Lincoln's domestic policies focused on preserving the Union and stopping the spread of slavery. He implemented several measures to achieve these goals, including the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railroad Act, which encouraged settlement and development in the West. The Homestead Act, which was signed into law in 1862, granted 160 acres of public land to any person, including immigrants, who were at least 21 years old and had never taken up arms against the U.S. government. To receive a homestead, an individual had to live on the land for 5 years, make improvements to the property, and pay a small filing fee. The act was intended to encourage settlement and development in the West and played a significant role in the expansion of the United States. The Pacific Railroad Act, also known as the 1862 Land Grant Act, was passed in the same year as the Homestead Act. It granted land and government funding to the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroad companies to build a transcontinental railroad connecting the east and west coasts of the United States. The act was a major infrastructure project that helped to spur economic development in the West and played a key role in the growth of the country. Lincoln's political views. Lincoln was a strong believer in democracy and the rule of law, and he saw the Union as a vital part of the country's democratic system. He believed that the Constitution was the supreme law of the land and that it should be followed by all. Lincoln was also opposed to slavery and believed it was morally wrong. He saw the expansion of slavery as a threat to the principles of freedom and equality. Lincoln's views on secession. Lincoln strongly opposed the idea of secession and believed that the Union must be preserved at all costs. He argued that the Constitution did not give states the right to secede, and he took steps to prevent it from happening. However, several Southern states seceded from the Union anyway, leading to the formation of the Confederacy. Abolitionism. The abolitionist movement, which sought to end slavery, was strong in the North and was seen as a threat by the South. Many Southern states believed that the North was trying to interfere with their way of life and that abolitionism was a threat to their economy. States' rights. The issue of states' rights was also a key factor in the lead-up to the Civil War. The Southern states believed that they had the right to secede from the Union, while the Northern states argued that the Union was a permanent entity and that secession was not allowed under the Constitution. Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas was a significant event leading up to the Civil War. Bleeding Kansas was a term used to describe the violence and turmoil that occurred in the Kansas Territory in the 1850s. The conflict was sparked by the issue of slavery in the territory, as both Northern and Southern groups were vying for control and trying to determine whether Kansas would be a free or slave state. The violence in Kansas was fueled by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which repealed the Missouri Compromise and allowed settlers in the territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. This led to a surge of settlers from both the North and South moving to Kansas in an attempt to sway the vote in their favor. The conflict in Kansas took many forms, including election fraud, mob violence, and guerrilla warfare. It was characterized by a series of violent clashes between pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups, and it became known as Bleeding Kansas due to a large number of casualties and fatalities. The violence in Kansas was seen as a precursor to the larger conflict of the American Civil War, and was one of the key events leading up to the outbreak of hostilities. It highlighted the deep divide between the North and South and the tensions that were building over the issue of slavery. John Brown's Raid. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was a significant event leading up to the American Civil War. Brown, who was an abolitionist, led a group of followers in an attack on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia, in 1859. The group's goal was to seize weapons and start a slave rebellion, with the hope of eventually overthrowing slavery throughout the South. The raid was unsuccessful, and Brown and his followers were quickly captured. Brown was put on trial and found guilty of treason, murder, and inciting a slave insurrection. He was sentenced to death and was hanged in December 1859. Despite the failure of the raid, it had a significant impact on the country and was seen as a major threat by the South. The raid was seen as evidence of the North's hostility towards slavery and further fueled tensions between the two sides. It was one of the key events leading up to the outbreak of the Civil War and is remembered as a turning point in the fight against slavery. Sectionalism. Sectionalism, or loyalty to one's own region rather than to the country as a whole, was a significant factor that contributed to the divide between the North and South in the lead-up to the American Civil War. The North and South had developed into distinct regions with different economies, cultures, and political views, and this led to a deepening divide between the two sides. One of the key issues that fueled sectionalism was slavery. The North opposed slavery and saw it as a moral evil, while the South relied on it for their economic success and saw it as a vital part of their way of life. This disagreement over slavery was a major factor in the divide between the North and South and contributed to the tensions that eventually led to the Civil War. Other issues that contributed to the divide between the North and South included states' rights, tariffs, and the expansion of the United States. The North and South had different views on these issues, and they often clashed over them. Overall, sectionalism and the divide between the North and South played a significant role in the lead-up to the Civil War. The two sides were deeply divided over a variety of issues, and these divisions eventually led to the outbreak of hostilities. Attempts at peace. There were several attempts at peace prior to the outbreak of the American Civil War. One of the earliest attempts was the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state in an effort to balance the number of slave and free states in the Union. The compromise also established the 36-30 parallel as the dividing line between slave and free territory in the Louisiana Purchase. Another attempt at peace was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which repealed the Missouri Compromise and allowed settlers in the territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. This led to a surge of settlers from both the North and South moving to Kansas in an effort to influence the outcome, and the resulting violence and turmoil in the territory became known as Bleeding Kansas. The Compromise of 1850 was another attempt at peace that aimed to address the issue of slavery in the territories. The compromise admitted California as a free state, established the Fugitive Slave Act, which required the return of escaped slaves to their owners, and ended the slave trade in Washington, D.C. The compromise also established a stricter Fugitive Slave Act that required the return of escaped slaves and imposed heavy fines and prison sentences on those who assisted them. Despite these attempts at peace, the issue of slavery and the expansion of the United States remained a source of tension and disagreement between the North and South, and it eventually led to the outbreak of the American Civil War. The two sides of the war. During the American Civil War, the Union and the Confederacy were the two main sides that fought against each other. The Union, also known as the North, was made up of 22 northern states and the federal government, while the Confederacy, also known as the South, was made up of 11 southern states that seceded from the Union. The Union was represented by the Stars and Stripes, the national flag of the United States. The Confederacy had a variety of flags throughout the course of the war, the most well-known of which was the Stars and Bars, which featured a blue field with white stars and red bars. The states that made up the Union were California, Connecticut, Delaware, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Wisconsin. The states that made up the Confederacy were Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. Both the Union and the Confederacy had advantages and disadvantages in the conflict. The Union had a larger population and a more industrialized economy, which gave it an advantage in terms of resources and manufacturing. It also had a larger navy and a more centralized government. However, it had the challenge of fighting a war on multiple fronts, as it had to defend the border with Canada, as well as the southern states. The Confederacy had a smaller population and a less industrialized economy, which made it more difficult for them to sustain a long war. They also had to contend with internal divisions and a lack of a centralized government. However, they had the advantage of fighting a defensive war on their own territory, and were able to use guerrilla tactics to their advantage. Overall, the Union and the Confederacy were two very different sides in the American Civil War, and they had a variety of advantages and disadvantages that played a role in the outcome of the conflict.